Thank you for joining us for this training on incident investigations. Before we get started, I want you to be sure you download the two resource files at the beginning of this training entitled Incident Investigations Worksheet 1 and Worksheet 2. My name is John. I'm a Human Performance Specialist with Pinnacle Assurance. Today's training is not intended to be a how-to or a technical training on the logistics of performing investigations. What we want to present to you today is some theory or concepts. We want to teach you a new approach that's going to help you conduct more effective investigations, and results that you get from those investigations you're going to be able to use to derive performance improvements across your organization. To launch us into that thought, I want you to consider this quote from Sidney Dekker. Underneath every simple, obvious story about human error, there's a deeper, more complex story about the organization. When we conduct our investigations, we're looking to determine a root cause. We want to ensure accountability, we want to prevent recurrence, but the focus for those investigations usually goes to the employee that was involved. In order to get real improvement, in order to really prevent things from occurring in the future, you need to get that deeper story to understand what's going on, the why behind, and that's what today's training will give you. The knowledge to help you discover that why, understand what led to the human error in these situations. This training is focused primarily on the approach you take to the investigation itself, but as you know, that's just a portion of the entire process. We're going to work through the process the way you would with any investigation, starting with your arrival on the scene, through the investigation, identifying your root causes, and then coming up with corrective actions. Now, my experience is in workers' compensation, so in my world, incidents are workplace injuries. But the techniques I'm going to teach you are going to apply to any unplanned event that occurs in your environment. Issues with property damage, incidents where there's equipment failure, where there's an environmental release. Typically, as the investigator, you may be one of the first ones on the scene shortly after the incident. Your first priority needs to be securing that scene, making sure in the event of a property damage that the property is secure, the building you're in is safe, making sure equipment's been powered down, anyone who is injured in the course of things has been attended to. Any environmental releases are being managed, those processes are in place. And then once you know the scene is safe and secure, that's when we can start to work on learning why this happened. Most commonly, when we start to look at incidents and piece things together, what we're using is a linear mental model. This diagram shows you an illustration of that, where we have an event, we start to work backwards from the event, and using the information we find, piece together what actually caused the event. And that takes us hopefully to a root cause. This illustration specifically demonstrates the 5 whys technique, which if you're familiar with that, you start at your incident and you'll ask the question at number 1, why did that incident occur? Once you have your answer, you'll ask at number 2, why did number 1 occur? And then at number 3, why did number 2 occur? Et cetera, et cetera. And you work back until you've asked the question why 5 times, and in theory, that gets you to the root cause. And again, this is human nature. We're wired to look for that linear cause and effect. So even if you're not following a specific procedure like that, your brain is automatically taking the bits of information you've been presented or that you've gleaned from your time on scene, and it's starting to make those connections and those associations for you. We're going to have an exercise now where we're going to use this linear model to start an incident investigation. So if you're new to the subject of incident investigations, this will be a great introduction practice to see how this really works. And if you have some experience with investigations, this is going to get your investigative juices flowing, get you into that mindset. So at the beginning of this training, you should have downloaded 2 worksheets. For this activity, we're going to be using the worksheet titled Incident Investigations Worksheet Number 1. In a moment, I'm going to show you a video that's describing an incident with an Amtrak train that occurred in 2015. As you're watching the video, start to make note of potential causes, potential factors that were going on in the environment at the time. Start to work on your incident investigation as you begin to piece together what could have caused this event, and maybe even come up with your preliminary root cause based on those findings.
What happened in the last moments of Amtrak 188? The train quickly accelerated in its last minute, barreling down the tracks north of Philadelphia at more than twice the speed for a corner ahead, captured on this security footage obtained by our station WPVI. Moments later, a flash as the train careened off the tracks. And now an account of some kind of projectile hitting the windshield. The story from an assistant conductor listening to her engineer, 32-year-old Brandon Bostian, on the radio.
She also believed that she heard her engineer say something about his train being struck by something.
The FBI has been asked to join the investigation to examine the damage to the train's windshield and reports of other trains in that area being struck at about the same time.
An unknown object made contact with that train, shattering the windshield.
But even if the Amtrak train was hit by something before derailing, how does that explain the sudden acceleration? 10 minutes out of Philadelphia, it's at the speed limit, 70 miles an hour. Then in the final minute, a quick acceleration, 80 miles an hour, then 90. Just 16 seconds before derailment, more than 100 miles an hour. Reaching that 50-mile-an-hour curve, the brakes are applied, but it's too late. The engineer tells investigators he has no memory of the moments before the crash or the crash itself, which killed 8 and injured hundreds and shut down part of the busiest rail corridor in the country. Before reopening, the Federal Railroad Administration is ordering Amtrak to take some immediate safety precautions, requiring all trains be outfitted with onboard speed control technology and calling for inspections of curved tracks and increased speed limit signage on the Northeast Corridor. But this part of the corridor doesn't have the newest technology that can actually stop a speeding train. CEO Joseph Boardman now promises that technology.
As we get started to debrief what you just watched, I want to make sure, level set, that we're all on the same page here. So hopefully you recognize from that video that the event we're investigating was a train derailment. Be aware that this reporting is from the morning after the incident. So what you're watching is fresh. It's less than 12 hours after that train went off the tracks. So possibly similar to what you might experience if you're one of the early people on responding to an incident in your organization. So what were some of the factors that you noted? There's some conversation about potential thrown object, a broken windshield, there was some radio chatter. We heard comments about the train's speed, acceleration, going too fast. There was some braking, maybe the brakes were applied too late, something about positive train control. So again, it's still very raw. We still have a lot of unknowns out there. You probably have more questions than answers at this point. But is this realistic? Does this feel like what you often encounter when you show up in the workplace responding to an incident? As you start to piece that together, I know you have questions right now, but you're probably leaning towards a root cause. You probably have something in mind at least that you want to explore. And if I had my guess, you're probably focused in some way on the engineer in this scenario. Before we go any further, I want you to note that this form is really to help introduce or illustrate the concepts that we're talking about right now. This is not something that is required. It's not something that needs to be a part of your investigations, but hopefully it's giving you an idea of how these processes are working in your brain at the time. And again, I think it's a pretty good representation of how that linear model works. However, we all know that in real life, things are rarely that simple. And that's what this diagram is hoping to capture. Every day in the work environment, we have the parameters of the work that's being performed. You can see in the red, there's those hazards and risks that are inherent in the job. And then there's all this other noise. There's the production pressures. There's the constraints from resources. There's issues with communication on the team. We have processes where there's a known flaw or deficiency, things that don't work right. I imagine that you can find at least one or two things on this list that you deal with on a regular basis. This is what every work environment looks like. You have factors that are present all the time. At any given moment, one of those factors or some combination of those factors starts to have a greater influence and changes the hazards or the risks that are present in the workplace. And even though your employees are dealing with this continuously, only rarely do we end up with an unplanned incident. An effective incident investigation is going to focus on learning about this context, understanding what was going on when the event occurred. Obviously, we want to identify those factors that led to the event, but recognize that this context drives behaviors. And hopefully, as you begin to recognize and account for everything that's going on at every given moment, you're going to start to understand why I said earlier that human error is a symptom of incidents, not a primary cause. Human error is also a label that we assign after the fact, once we have an outcome that we can assess. In the field of human organizational performance, there's an illustration or a concept that talks about work as planned or work as imagined versus work as the way it's actually done every day. What you see on the screen right now, that black line, represents work as imagined. So we have our defined start point and end point for a job or for a task. And within that, we set the schedule, we have our policies, we have our standard operating procedures. We know how the work's going to proceed. We know when we've started the work. We know when the work is going to end. What you see in the blue line is the way work actually gets performed every day, based on all of that context, all that noise in the environment we just looked at. There's normal variability to everything. So we see sometimes, if we use the black line as a reference, where work is going better than expected. We see times where maybe it's not going as well as expected. But throughout the process, we're still trending towards that completion, and we still have that red hazard line outline over there. And occasionally, we have an intersection, and that's where we have that event occurs. And then because it was the employee that was making these changes and correcting on the fly, we call it human error. Recognize as you look at this too that there's a lot of times where things are going better than expected, where we're on time, where we're ahead of schedule, where we're under budget. You don't have to wait for that incident to occur before you can begin learning. And you're probably going to be very effective if you start to learn when things are going well too. But with all that noise in the environment, how do we account for or capture that context and make sense of it? One tool is the fishbone template, which you see on the screen behind me. At the beginning of this training, you should have downloaded 2 worksheets. This is the worksheet titled Incident Investigations Worksheet number 2. And again, the worksheet is a fishbone template. For our purposes, we've already populated some categories on each fin, but you can see why it gets the name fishbone, the central spine, the fins that are coming off of each one. And again, this is an illustrative form. It's to help you understand this concept. It's not a required form, but you may find it valuable in your processes. So for this next exercise, we're going to practice using this fishbone template. I'm going to share another video with you. This is also about that Amtrak train derailment from 2015. So it's the same incident that you viewed earlier at a different point in time. As you're watching the video, I want you to listen for some of the causal factors that are revealed this time. Capture them wherever you feel they're appropriate on this template. Maybe they'll fit in more than one place. Also feel free to add anything that you learned from the prior video as well as we go through this.
This is eerily similar, though, to last May when a commuter train was hit by something just before an Amtrak regional train crashed in Philadelphia. That crash killed 8 and injured nearly 200. And today, federal investigators gave us an update on their investigation. Here's Chris Van Cleve.
Newly released pictures taken from Train 188's dash camera show the moment the speeding train left the tracks. Engineer Brandon Bastian told investigators about a minute before the accident he realized he was going 10 miles too slow and began accelerating. His next memory was feeling as though I was going too fast around a curve. The train's event recorder found Bastian applied full throttle approximately 1.5 miles from the curve. The train reached 106 miles an hour before Bastian hit the emergency brakes. He said, "I remember holding onto the controls tightly and feeling like, okay, well, this is it. I'm going over." Toxicology reports found no evidence of drugs or alcohol in Bastian's blood, and he was not using his cell phone at the time of the crash. Lawyer Tom Klein represents several of the hundreds who were injured.
The train was being operated at 106 miles an hour, and there was a system that could have been in place and in fact was on place going the other way on the tracks, which could have prevented it.
That technology, Positive Train Control, or PTC, is now active along Amtrak's heavily used Northeast Corridor linking Boston to Washington, D.C.
I'm actually going to try and put full power on the train here, see how fast I can go.
Amtrak's Chris Jagodinsky showed us how PTC prevents a train from going too fast.
Now what happened here is this, traction blocked, penalty brakes. So it's taking away all my power in the locomotive and just giving me a penalty. Now it's applying the brakes.
So regardless of what you do now, the train's
I can't do anything. So I can't do anything. The computer's taken over.
Investigators found no issues with the train, the tracks, or the signals. Scott, we still don't know definitively if and when an object may have struck the train's windshield and if that could have contributed to the crash. A lawyer for Bastian declined to comment.
And 106 miles an hour was double the speed limit on that curve. Chris, thanks very much.
So did you learn anything new from this video? Obviously, we got some questions answered that were floating around the last time. We know there's no drugs or alcohol involved. We know that the cell phone use was not a factor. We know that the train, the tracks, the equipment were all in good working order. We still have some questions about that windshield strike. We did learn more about the train speed. We learned more about the timing, the sequence of events, and some of the decisions that were made. We had some input from the engineer now. And we've collected a lot of information about the event, so we have even more than we had before, more factors that could have contributed to this. And as you look at the fishbone, you'll see that you might have the same factor pop up in different places. So maybe you identify the positive train control, and you thought that was a management decision because it wasn't in place, or it impacted the equipment that was there because of the way it would have operated. So you can see that you might have the same factor that could fit into multiple places. And that can help you identify who has the source of control over that particular factor. You can see how those variables are really connected in real time within this environment, how you might have one factor influencing more than one category. And recognize too that within each one of those categories, that same factor could fail or cause a different occurrence or contribute to the event in a different way. So looking at this higher level view, seeing where things slot in, it can help you prioritize, especially when you start to see those factors popping up in multiple places. Now, with the information we have with these new factors in place, are you still thinking that the engineer may bear some responsibility for this event? Keep in mind, you have the benefit of knowing how this turns out, and the engineer didn't at the moment. So ask yourself that if the engineer knew what the result was going to be, would he have still taken the same actions that he did? This is something that's known as hindsight bias. As an investigator walking in fresh, you probably know more about that incident than the engineer did at the time it happened. So this image is representative of the event unfolding. The engineer is the figure you see at the left. As these events are unfolding real time, he is in the tunnel and only dealing with what's visible to him, the factors that are popping up in the moment. As the investigator, you're standing on the right side, looking back, and you're standing outside the tunnel so you can appreciate the entire picture. It's also well enough after the fact that you know how things turn out in the end. Because you know how this turns out, you know what to look for, you know what's going to be important, and that's going to bias you within this investigation, because what you're looking for is what you're going to find. Once you've established that root cause or that idea, there's a whole host of mental biases that come into place because we're wired to make the information we have fit into the story that we've created. Now, that's human nature. We can't make those biases go away, but as an investigator, you need to be on guard against those biases. Stay open-minded and recognize that there are many causal factors that could have led to this incident. Keep in mind, too, what we said earlier, that the context drives behavior. So when you're dealing with a human error or a potential human error, your goal should be to understand that context, to understand what was going on well enough so that if it was you in that situation, you would have acted the same way as the employee did. Incidents occur all the time. We only pay attention to them if things don't turn out the way we planned. Again, have you ever investigated when things were going better than expected? So where does all of this lead us? After we've identified our root causes, we've conducted an effective investigation, now we need to identify the corrective actions. And again, depending on your approach, if we're trying to fix the person or we're trying to hold someone accountable, we're going to approach that differently than we would if we're actually trying to fix the process and improve our organization. In this particular event, the National Transportation and Safety Board determined that human error was the primary cause, that the engineer lost situational awareness. They also recommended that there should be inward-facing cameras installed on the trains so that in future events, they'd be able to see what that engineer was doing at the moment. So think about that. If we focus on that recommendation or that outcome, we focus on situational awareness and we work on improving the operator's situational awareness. Does that prevent another train derailment? Was the issue in this case the fact that the engineer lost situational awareness? Or was the real issue that any human being exposed to those environmental inputs would have lost situational awareness? You also heard about positive train control. Positive train control eliminates that potential for any human error. You saw in the video how it takes the human out of the equation. If we're truly looking to prevent occurrences, what's going to be more effective? That situational awareness training for the individual, or the engineering solution that keeps the individual from having to maintain situational awareness at all times? In this particular case, the positive train control, it's not a small investment. It's $50,000 a mile to install. So the section of track we're talking about where this derailment occurred would have cost about $4.75 million. But at the end, Amtrak paid out over $265 million to the victims. So maybe that cost benefit's a little bit off. Or maybe that's easy to see because of my hindsight bias. This was a tragic incident. 8 people were left dead. We had 200 plus injured. I mentioned the money Amtrak had paid out. The engineer was facing life in prison in Pennsylvania. The state attorney general decided to bring charges, and he was standing trial for 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 200 counts of reckless endangerment, and 1 count of causing a catastrophe. So there's a lot of ancillary damage as a result of this too. It's not just the train, it's not just the person, it's not just the loss of life. This was a big event. And most times when we have an incident that occurs, there are wider reaching implications than just the person that moment. If you want to recognize real organizational improvements, you need to start to shift to a learning mindset. If you're only looking at incidents to fix them, you're going to miss out on those opportunities to learn more about the system and actually make improvements to the system. So we need to start to move from a who failed mentality and start to consider what failed, or more importantly, why that failed. Once you have that why, you can identify and prioritize, and then start to address the real factors that are influencing events in your organization. And the most important piece of that, once you've identified those corrective actions, is implementing them. Following through on the implementation, following through on those solutions. So remember, the same factors are always present in the work environment. When things go well, which they typically do, it's because of your employees. When things don't go well and there's an unplanned outcome, you have an incident and you have an investigation, which is a very effective learning tool. Not only to address the incidents, but also for you to gain valuable information about what goes on day to day in your organization. And you need to learn before you can effectively address any problems. Thank you for joining us today.